Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Flight 229, you're clear for departure.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Mann, and this is the Business Aviation Podcast. On this podcast, we interview business aviation professionals with all sorts of backgrounds to learn about experiences, tips, and best practices to be successful. Today's guest is Sebastien Roy, my co-founder, CEO, and the person behind the original idea for Lean Systems. Seb grew up in Sherbrooke, Quebec, in Canada, and did his undergrad, master's, and Ph.D. at Université de Sherbrooke in physics, with his graduate work focusing on superconductivity. After his postgraduate work, he began working at AdOpt, an operations research company specializing in solving optimization problems like crew scheduling for some of the world's top commercial aviation companies. He graduated from Founder Institute Montreal with me, which is where we met, and he refined his idea for what would become Lean Systems and convinced me to join as a co-founder. As one would expect of co-founders, I have an immense amount of respect for Seb. He's one of the smartest, hardworking, and thoughtful people I know. This conversation is a bit of an introduction and background to Seb and Lean Systems and how optimization works in commercial and business aviation. This chat lays the groundwork for some future episodes where we're going to chat in depth about how optimization can be applied in business aviation and how some of the latest technology, including machine learning and artificial intelligence, can be applied in the industry. Make sure to check out the show notes for details and links from the conversation at leansystems.co/podcast. Enjoy. Hey Seb, how are you today?
Pretty good.
Normally I'd say thanks for coming on and so on, and good to talk to you, but that happens on a daily basis anyway, so it's not as big a deal. We'll start back, I guess, at the start of your professional career, which I'll define as when you started school. And you studied at University of Sherbrooke, and you did physics for your undergrad. What made you choose physics?
That's a very good question. So when I've always been drawn to science since a very early age, I was reading those magazines we have in French in Quebec called Les Débrouillards. And I had like all these small sort of kids experiment toys and was drawn to astronomy. So when I moved further during my studies, I was spending more time on science, biology, chemistry, physics, and so on. And I felt that physics is the most fundamental science out there. So like, sorry to break it down to you guys, but everything else is physics as well. So so that's the main reason I went there. And I stayed in Sherbrooke because for my postgraduate studies as well, because when I was in grade 4 in high school, there was something about superconductivity, and I was heavily drawn to this because I liked electricity, electronics. I'm building guitar amps and stuff like that. And so when I realized that Sherbrooke was one of the leading research centers in the field, it made no sense to me to like leave my hometown just because. So
you took the next question I was going to ask you right away. I mean, you grew up in Sherbrooke, but I was going to ask if there's another reason you were going to stick around. And as it turns out, University of Sherbrooke's well known in a few physics fields, right? Superconductivity being one of them, but there's others too, right?
Yeah, it led to quantum computing. So now they're shifting toward. So there's Alexandre, whom I shared my office during my graduate studies, who's part of the EPIC, one of the leading like research group now in quantum computing.
Right. And did you study superconductivity for your master's and PhD theses?
Yeah, so my master's and PhD were both like theoretical physics on the same model, which is called the Hubbard model for 2D electron gas on a crystal lattice. And so it's solid state physics with what we call correlated electrons physics. which is related to superconductivity, high temperature superconductivity. So
so what's in layman's terms, what are some potential applications for like either superconductivity in general or the specific research you were looking at?
Yeah, so that specific research. Okay, so there's a few different types of superconducting materials. There's what we call the classic superconductors, and you have the high temperature and the organic superconductors. And there might be some other weird niche superconductors that I'm forgetting about, but they all have widely different physical properties aside from all being superconductors. And the high temperature superconductors are fascinating because superconductivity can have, well, it will have application in quantum computing, but it will also have application in various other fields. And if we figure out how to create superconductors that are superconducting at room temperature, this will it will be a major technological breakthrough, which will cause a massive revolution in terms of things we do. You can think of electric cars. You can think just energy sector as a whole would be totally transformed, medical sector and so on. So trying to crack the code of how high temperature superconductivity works might lead to figure out how to combine components to discover room temperature superconductors.
Right. And without getting too deep into it, obviously quantum computing will essentially replace every computing function that we have right now.
Well, it's hard to tell at this stage because classic computers do very well a bunch of things that quantum computers can't necessarily do better, but there are some class of problems that we could solve with quantum computing that are barely solvable today. So there's many physical systems we don't understand that we could solve almost automatically with quantum computers, which would also generate a bunch of scientific breakthroughs in various fields. Think of DNA sequencing, or there's many other physical systems that we could crack that might lead to new technology that we could use in various fields.
Right. Okay. So, both obviously have massive applications. That's interesting that University of Sherbrooke's a leader in that space.
Yep.
So as a bit of an aside, I want to bring it up because I think it's a fascinating story and speaks a bit to your work ethic and perhaps sometimes irrational desire to bring on a bunch of things at once. But you have 3 kids now who are what?
12 and 15.
So 2 twins that are 12 and a daughter who's 15.
Exactly.
And you were in the process of starting a family while you were doing your Ph.D.?
Yes. So during my PhD, I recorded 2 albums with my band. I had 3 kids and I built a house.
Right. And so I'd forgotten about the 2 recordings, but the question still applies. How did you manage all of that?
That's a very good question.
And I should say, how did you and your girlfriend manage all that? Because she was doing her PhD as well at the time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But she took some breaks. In between. So I don't know how to pull it off. The construction work was, I think, a very good way to learn how to spend the amount of time required to build a startup, which is from 9 to 5, I would be working on my PhD. And then from 5 to 9, I would work on the house. And then over the weekends from, say, 6 a.m. Saturday until our arms are aching so much we just can't move anymore, and start back on Sundays for a full 3 months. And the cool thing with that is we were so busy building the house that our spendings were 0. So just building it could pay it off pretty well. So,
and I'm interested in the home building these days, mostly because I've been reading a bit myself, but your father-in-law is a builder, right? Or your father?
So my father-in-law is an electrician, and my father was a builder, and my
Right.
grandfather as well. So
Which obviously helps. But did you design the whole house yourself?
yes.
And then,
Well, yes and no. We took plans from the internet and we designed for simplicity and material reuse. So like you'll see where I'm like what I'm doing now. So we've optimized the layout of the house in such a way that building would be easier, so take less time and reuse more materials. So we picked the size of the front of the house in such a way that the coverage, that the roof shingles. The shingles were an exact integer number of shingles per row. So when you were shifting one row to the next, you could cut one shingle in half and reuse it at the other end. Yeah, so that we could split the shingle in half and reuse it at the other end. And it was an integer fraction of a multiple of 16 inches. So it was the same thing for all the walls that we laid out. So no waste anywhere. And the basement was a perfect square. So doing all the concrete thing is much easier if it's a perfect square than if you have like a bunch of catch and stuff
right.
around the house. So,
and did you built it start to finish in 3 months?
We did everything, every freaking thing. There's only one thing we've outsourced, which is the gutter, because since it was a square house, having like a bunch of pieces of 10 feet gutters glued together is, well, it's painful to install, and it leaks all the time. So like it costs $200 to have a guy come with the aluminum sheets and like roll it out for the perfect length.
Right.
And the other thing was, digging the hole. Like we need special licenses to operate the machinery, so we had that done as well.
Right. Wow. So if thought your days were busy, try raising a few kids and doing a PhD and building a house and recording some albums. So this was obviously an early application of some optimization, but after your postdoc, you went to work at a company called Adopt.
Yeah.
And so maybe tell me a bit about what Adopt does and why you chose to start working there, and then sort of what your role was.
So Adopt is specialized in what we call scheduled operations for the airline industry. They're optimizing aircraft routing and crew scheduling for most of the top airline companies in the world, like EasyJet, Emirates Airlines, Air Canada, Air Transat, and so on. And the main reason why I landed there is part chance, part design. So when I left university, my core skills were like high performance computing. Think of memory allocation optimization and runtimes optimization, looking at the core map in the algorithms and figure out how to make it run faster and so on, or use less memory so you can crunch larger problems. And the University of Sherbrooke was a national leader in Canada to build Beowulf clusters based on Linux at a time where Linux wasn't as popular as it is now for cloud services. And so I had a lot of experience in Linux. And at the time when I moved to Montreal, finding jobs working on Linux systems was fairly hard to find. And this was one of the criteria. So I had to find something where I could leverage as much as possible my like high performance computing skills, so scientific computing stuff, and working in a Linux environment. And Adopt offered that. I was looking around many things, and it's actually a job post that was sent to me by my mom. And when I read the description at first, I'm like, yeah, what the hell is that? Like, it doesn't match. So in the desired nice to have, there was having a PhD in physics. I'm like, well, if they're open to hiring physicists, and PhD, like physics PhD, kind of have a bad reputation on like in a workplace. And I repeat that to everyone. It's like each and every physics PhD are really arrogant and think they know everything, but maybe less than half of them are right. So it's kind of an uphill battle to find something in the workplace. So that's how I landed there. And when I start working on those problems, like this was really exciting to me. Like I really love that. And as a physicist, one of the sort of hack that we can use is that we're used to use mathematical apparatus as tools rather than an end in itself. And most people who work in operation research have math degrees, and these guys usually prefer running the proofs than using the systems. And as physicists, we learn to approximate problems, like the old joke of how do you know how many chicken you can fit in the barn? And let's assume they're spheres. So approximation is one of the most important skills you need to develop to be a good physicist, and it's super useful in operation research when comes time to apply those in practice and in the industry. It's how you figure out like the most efficient way to translate a complex business problem into math equations, leveraging tools that are pre-built.
Right. So, I mean, you didn't really necessarily have an interest in operations research before you went to Adopt. Maybe just give a definition of what operations research is, and then the types of problems you were dealing with Adopt obviously fell under that. But what sort of problems fall under the operations research sphere?
Yes. So, operation research is a fairly broad field that can go from simple analytics to all the way to what we call decision-making algorithms or decision-making automation, which is now being labeled as prescriptive analytics. So if you think of all the fields of data treatment you can make, you kind of have the state, like step one is storing data. Step two could be cleaning that stored data. Step three would be visualizing data. Step four would be something like generate insights from the data. The next step would be make predictions, and eventually, and at every step, like users of the data will make decisions based on that data. And if you think of visualizing data, you will run the calculations to make decisions in your head, like manually, if you will. But operation research, like mathematical programming, which is one of the subfields of operation research, which is the one we're working with, then you can just encode decision-making mechanism and then automate the whole decision-making process. And then you can segment that prescriptive analytics part further, depending on the level of control you have in how the let's say the business entities that are related to your decision making can be, say, fixed or not, or the level of control you have on it. So just to give a concrete example, if you think of scheduled aviation, or supply chain management, the level of uncertainty for predicting the future is low enough that you can plan for super long windows. So you can plan for the next 6 months or the next month or the next week and have say less than 10% changes in your planned schedule. But if you take the other extreme, which is like emergency vehicles, there's no way you can start making decisions until some specific events happens. So it's sort of the pure real time to the completely static, preemptive sort of decision making. And I'm kind of framing the discussion toward scheduling, since this is the area in which I have the most experience. But you can also think of like infrastructure. So I know some people who build decision-making algorithms for, say, cities to decide if they should change the water pipes at the same time as, say, the underground electricity network, to avoid digging holes twice, which would be more expensive than doing everything at once, while not waiting too long as to avoid failures of the system.
Right. Okay. So, I think that's a fairly good segue, given the scope of the problems that you just mentioned, with sort of supply chain management on one end, let's say, and emergency vehicles on the other. At Adopt, you were working on commercial aviation.
Yep.
We're talking a bit about, well, we'll get back to business aviation. So in a general sense, so you started mentioning it, like, in commercial aviation, things tend to be scheduled ahead. There's less disruption, etc. Mm-hmm. So in a general sense like that, and then specifically from the point of view of solving the related optimization problems, how are commercial aviation and business aviation similar, and how are they different?
Right. One way I like to look into this is, or think of it, is in the 80s, 90s, we would have high quality optimization system for scheduled operations, be it aviation or anything else. And you can think of businesses changing the way they're operating to kind of match the requirements for using those optimization systems. And it made sense because you could save so much money using the optimized solutions that adapting your way of operating to the software made economic sense. Now in 2000, or like between 2005 and 2010, the on-demand gig occurred. So you'd be optimizing for user experience as opposed to resource management, where people demanding things would be serviced as efficiently as possible, which is a completely different optimization problem. But one of the main issues with the pure on-demand model is that it's resource inefficient, and it may work well for Uber or courier deliveries like Amazon and stuff like that. But if you have higher cost resources, then the pure on-demand system is too expensive. So now you see a shift in many industries that is somewhere in between, which is, we're not last minute, we're not purely on demand. We can plan ahead, but not that much. And the level of disruption can be fairly high. So in city public transit, they call that demand responsive transport. And I think that business aviation or unscheduled operations have always been similar to this. And it's super exciting for these guys because now we're starting to build technology to service these types of problems, because we have a lot of reason to think that this will be a better solution in the near future than the purely on-demand, which is one extreme, and the purely scheduled static optimization, which is the other.
Right. Now, why, given that generally planned ahead operations are more efficient, why, for example, do you think, as you just mentioned, this hybrid model might be better or more efficient than commercial operations in its optimal implementation?
You can have you have various business cases where the amount of disruption on a plan schedule is so large that planning too much ahead is pointless. So if you think of any different resource allocation problem as being more resource efficient if you plan ahead, but having a fragile planning because the amount of disruption is too large. But if you plan too last minute, you're not as resource efficient as you can be. You can think of it as having an optimal point in between, which is the ideal planning window you can use where you minimize the amount of disruption, but at the same time, you maximize your capability to look at all your resources in a global perspective and reduce your overall cost or increase dramatically your capacity,
Right.
which translates to increased revenues.
Right. And I think the other point there that if you're a lot of commercial aviation operations are susceptible to, because they plan in advance, they aren't necessarily prepared for disruptions that inevitably occur and therefore respond to them more poorly than if they had planned better in sort of the hybrid model, which accounts for some sort of disruption.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that at that level, the size of their operations is so large that we've yet to solve that problem. Like, I don't think there's any serious, powerful operations research driven solution that can tackle these problems because the size is so large.
Right. That's a good segue. Maybe just talk about a few of the examples of some of the larger or more difficult or interesting problems that you've worked on in commercial aviation.
Okay. Yeah. So I think by far the most interesting one was EasyJet because their business model is centered around acquiring local carriers and expanding this way in Europe. So they started out in Luton in the UK, and they've been buying other companies that are similar to them. And then they sort of use what I would refer to as a target model, so to speak, where they standardize operation in all their acquisition companies. And so they design a model in terms of which aircraft they fly, what type of crew composition they use, what type of mix in terms of, so they have the CAP 371 rule set in Europe, which is pretty funky compared to what we're used to in North America, even though we've kind of upgraded our rule set to match a bit what they have. And given the high complexity of those rule sets, they've built some strong heuristics around this. And those heuristics end up in employee contracts. So they become like business rules, hard rules that needs to be observed. And as a result, they had something like 20 or 30 different type of rule sets across all their operations. And they would shift crew members from one place to the next, moving with their working contract. And so that account on its own had, I think, 10 times as many rules as all the other clients combined.
Which makes for an interesting problem, but also a very difficult one.
Yeah, but like it's great because it was something new or something never seen at before, and it forced us to rethink how we tackle these problems, and that extra generalization, let's say, in terms of how you approach any scheduling problem can lead to having much more flexible solutions that can solve new problems that were unsolvable before.
Right. So we'll probably skip a couple of years here, but I think that's a good segue to how you got to lean systems and so on. But before we get there, I mean, I think that was around the time where you conceived sort of the initial idea behind lean systems and the innovation in terms of model and how it was delivered. So maybe talk a little bit about how that idea came to you and what the difference is, or what the innovation and the idea really is.
Yeah. So I think the simplest way to put it is that ADAP was in a usual model for operation research companies that does mathematical programming, which is target top market enterprise large companies. So you can think of the energy sector, trains, airline industry, city public transit, and so on, like very large cash flow industries with, let's say, typically razor thin margins. And so their model was tailored around that. So there's a lot, like, implementation time is super long, sales cycle are horribly long, and the it's more driven toward raw performance rather than flexibility or adaptability of the solution, because the adaptability itself can be sold as an after sale service. So the main idea was, if we can simplify how we adapt the solution to one specific problem and reduce the internal cost dramatically, then we can roll out like these algorithms to smaller problems that might not be as large, not as capital intensive, but where the number of assets is so large that the potential savings is big. And then if you can find a large enough market to provide that solution to, then you can create immense value. And so before circling back to transportation, I thought of other markets. So the main idea was looking for an underserved market that is large enough, that is adjacent to other large markets, for which the typical optimization solution do not use top of the line, best in class algorithms, where you can come in and say, we'll have some sort of a initial internal cost to produce the top of the line solution like we did. But once you're there, applying that super powerful technology to somewhat simpler problems than the usual yields way better results than the alternative in those space. So that was like the somewhat abstract, broad idea. And it brought me back to transportation because I know that space well. And business aviation is very related to scheduled aviation in terms of operating rules, and the vocabulary is similar and so on and so forth. So it was a very, very good sweet spot for me to start rolling out like those super high-end solution, and at the same time come up with new interpretation and how we should deliver those products to customers.
Right. So just to summarize, sort of the innovation was, we've got this amazing technology, but it's very high cost in the way it's currently rolled out because configuration is customized and done basically from scratch for each person. So how do we take that top end technology in terms of the optimization algorithms and the problem solving power and build it in such a way that it's much cheaper to configure and also much more flexible from the beginning, so that it can be applied to a bunch of people that normally wouldn't have been able to afford it previously.
Faster.
Right. So, and you just mentioned there, you looked at several other markets, and I know one of them was movie scheduling, which might seem completely unrelated, but again, it's a problem where there's a bunch of constraints and there's a large number of variables, but I think it's pervasive in a lot of industries that the difficulty in solving these problems is underestimated.
Yes. So,
and why are they so difficult to solve? But B, why do you think people underestimate how difficult they are to solve?
That's a very good question. So I think you don't need many assets to make problems difficult. Just think of trying to schedule a lunch with friends you haven't seen in a long time. Everyone has families. You need to pick a date. So this is kind of it's not that complex in the sense that you might have, say, 5 to 10 people, and you just want to pick one time slot where they're all available, but it's connected to everything else, which is their families and how that influence their time availabilities. Other great examples are like hockey tournaments, baseball tournaments, basketball tournaments, and so on. I had a friend at the physics department in Sherbrooke who said, "Hey, yeah, I would use that because I'm playing with bowling with my friends, and we have some rules in terms of who play with who during sort of the regular season. And we tried to write a software to do it, and it was not working because this is like, to use math jargon, NP hard problems, and which means if you find the right algorithm to solve it, it takes a polynomial time. So if you double the size of the problem, it quadruples the runtime, the number of iterations required to solve the problem. And there's no way to predict which iteration will yield a solution. You can prove that there is at least one iteration that will yield a solution, but it could be the last one. And
Right.
I mean, it's so easy to find these problems in day to day. Like my first epiphany was on vacation. We were on a all-inclusive resort. I was seeing all these guys traveling the beer cans and water bottles to the apartments, and I'm like, oh yeah. I mean, we could optimize the number of crate you can put in your truck and figure out the optimal route to make this as efficient as possible. This is like, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So if you can figure out a way to leverage the required insight to build a solution, then you can solve all these problems. And it's super repetitive, which yields to manual errors. But at the same time, it's so sophisticated that writing the actual code to do that is hard enough that we can make a business out of it. But also, it's I forgot my idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that often gets underestimated, or the thinking goes something like,
Yes.
well, we have a team that comes up with a solution now, day in and day out. So how hard can it be to program that? But often what is missed is you don't consider all the factors.
Yes.
So even from getting a few friends together for lunch, even if you send out the invite, you're not the one solving the whole problem. And if you were going to, you would have to consider all these factors that each person does individually.
Mm.
Or in the transportation context, people will, for ground transportation, for example, you'll have people that are more flexible. They work longer hours, or they live in a more advantageous place. If we're talking about taxis, for example.
Mm.
And so they will tend to get utilized a lot more because they're more flexible. And the same happens in any other industry, senior pilots or so on. And there's a lot of inefficiencies that are as a result of that. But what it really is just you're doing that because manually solving the problem, you physically can't consider all the solutions, which is where the mathematical approach finds all these efficiencies.
Yep. And I remembered my other point, which is the most amazing thing is that even for a fairly large problem, the human mind it's astonishingly good at solving these problems using strong heuristics. So when you come up with an automated technological solution, you need to at least match or beat the human mind. And this is insanely hard. it's somewhat easy for very small problems, but problems don't, like, the number of assets doesn't have to be that large to make it really hard to implement from a technological standpoint, as opposed to running it manually. But there's a point after which then, like, there's a breakdown, or so to speak, there's sort of a threshold. They are NP hard problems. So if you look at the evolution of runtime as a function of problem size, you hit the what we call the NP wall, where you just have like this exponential takeoff, where the amount of time required to solve the next largest problem is like more than your lifetime, or more than the amount of time you're allotted to solve the problem. And so I think humanly we hit that wall as well, somewhere between let's say 100 and 200 commodities, like 100 to 200 people you need to schedule, or 100 to 200 vehicles you need to route, and so on.
Right.
And going beyond that requires technology at that point. And even if you look at, so these solutions that's where what we're doing makes a massive difference, because these problems are impossible to solve otherwise.
Right. And I think anyone who's been in a growing business has probably experienced that. You get to a point where, like, oh shit, I'm not sure what to do now. And often the solution is to break it into smaller problems, like segmenting and scheduling them separately. But again, that's partially where inefficiencies are introduced. And then I think the other point there is it's very difficult to beat the human mind. So when you can do it and find those efficiencies, that's amazing. But there's an argument to be made too for just making that process transparent. So often when humans are solving these problems, a lot of the rules they're applying are either inexact or unconscious. And so when you lose someone from your business, or you want to consider changing the way you operate, giving employees some extra time off, or hiring new people, it becomes very, very difficult to predict those scenarios unless you have a process and technology in place, so that you can only focus on one variable and modify the others.
And like, I think one way to exemplify that is the technology we use is it's equivalent to generating thousands and hundreds of thousands of individual schedules per person, if we think of crew scheduling, as opposed to just running one and being done, and maybe swapping a few things here and there, and maybe changing things, shuffling things around. But it's basically like humans will find one solution that is fairly good, but the algorithm will go through all of them, given that you told it the right thing, or like implemented the right sort of constraints and rules in it, to make sure that the set of possible schedules fits within your specification in a systematic manner.
Right. So we'll do a couple more questions here, and then a few quick ones to wrap up. But one of the things we talked about the innovative model that we're sort of pursuing at Lean Systems. But I mean, there's been some technological advancements in the last few years that have garnered lots of attention, for better or worse, but do have applications to scheduling, routing, solving these optimization problems, most notably probably machine learning and AI, or AI, however you want to classify it.
Yeah.
But I mean, what are a few of the promising or potential applications of this type of technology in this sector?
Right. So the sort of the kind of trap with machine learning itself is that it's a form. So first off, the history of artificial intelligence went through various types of implementations, and operation research was in the class of expert systems, which is one of the big waves of AI that we had. Like, I think it was in the 70s, before the one we were surfing on now. But the deep learning and like what we call machine learning is good to solve problems on average. So when you're looking for a schedule, you're not looking for an average solution. You're looking for the exact solution you're required. So you cannot use machine learning to yield very good, efficient solutions from a scheduling perspective. But there is some elements to the application of the operation research mathematical programming system where you can leverage machine learning. So one of it is forecast. So if you can forecast stuff and predict stuff based on historical data, then you can use that as input parameters to your expert system to yield a more robust solution. So this is one example of application. There's other more technical, more scientific, or so to speak, applications that we can use, which is basically combining expert systems with machine learning to solve exact problems. So like there's a few sub-chunks of algorithms within mathematical programming that can be solved more efficiently with machine learning, which is another area that is interesting now. And the last one, which I think is the most exciting, is basically helping experts to implement customers' rules with AI-assisted technology. So in practice, like traditionally, what we do is that we sit down with customers, we ask them a bunch of questions to extract the rules and try to figure out how it fits inside a computer, and then go through revision cycles with them to figure out what we missed, interpretations, and sometimes you kind of have operations having to challenge themselves, because since they're manually doing stuff with it as a team, each team member might have a slightly different interpretation of the same rule, and they're actually applying it differently. So you need to sort through these things. But now you can apply machine learning to infer those rules, or at the very least, figure out what's a good compromise between, say, the hardcore, no compromise mathematical programming approach, as opposed to a softer one where you can combine the two technologies. And there's a lot of very exciting thing that we're experimenting at Lean Systems that hopefully will yield to, I think, fairly different products, like very different products than what we're used to in operation research, that will be way more useful to customers than what we're used to. Right.
And we'll have some chats in the future, and we'll dig deeper into each of those. So the last thing you're familiar with a lot of the areas in aviation where these types of technologies can be applied, but we're discovering more as we talk to more customers as well. What are a few of the areas where optimization technology can be applied and have good results in business aviation? I mean, routing planes or scheduling crew are two of the obvious ones for sure. And those can sometimes be tied or not tied. Are there other areas?
In aviation specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's if you think of the whole operation, everything is connected. So if we circle back to the example of the analogy of having dinner with friends, you have all these connected parts inside the operation that has an impact on everyone else. So think of training schedules, maintenance schedules for the aircrafts. But at the same time, you have there's a feedback loop with all that and how the sales team manage their capacity. And And if you think of it this way, you can think of it as a whole ecosystem of connected NP-hard problems. So figuring out the, let's say, the most convenient way for customers to start tackling all these problems together and have them speak to one another will dramatically improve efficiency in operations. And that's sort of feedback loop use case can be seen in other industries.
Right. So just to complete the lunch analogy, I mean, you can pick the optimal restaurant, which is like an ideal distance between each person. But if you pick one at one end, then or you can pick the time of day that people have the most availability. But if you pick a restaurant at, right next to someone's house, they're going to need less availability, whereas the person farthest away is going to need more, etc. And so, yeah, in an aviation operation, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of different components which each can individually be optimized. But the best implementation is when you can potentially solve them all together.
Yeah. Or
awesome.
At least have a very robust way to have them feed one another.
Right. Cool. All right. Well, we'll get into each of those specifically maybe in future. A few quick ones to wrap up here. When you think of the word successful, who's the first person who comes to mind and why?
Wow, that's a very good question. So I can anchor myself around my childhood heroes, which would be Einstein and Bad Religion singer Greg Graffin. Greg was a very strong inspiration for me to complete my Ph.D. and do other things at the same time. So he's a full tenure professor, and he wrote books while touring with his band. So the high productivity thing, and Einstein was just awesome. As a physicist, it's really hard not to think of this guy. And in both cases, I think it's the way I see that relating to what I'm doing. I think of it as, what can I be working on that really matters and that can make a difference to improve the life of as many people as possible around me. And once you've reached a certain point where you can look back and say, hey, here are all the things I've influenced in my life, and it was clearly a net positive, then I think this is how I could define my own success.
It's interesting. And I suspect that will be the only time that I ever get the Einstein and the lead singer of Bad Religion in the same sentence as the most successful people. Cool. What is a book or books that have had a large impact on you?
Oh boy, Gravitation. It was a painful read. So I haven't read a lot of books in a long time, but books I like to read are fantasy stuff, novels, and science books. And lately, of course, I've been reading more and more business books. So the last one I read that I remember dearly is 0 to 1 from Peter Thiel. And I think there's the Einstein book. I tried to remember the title, which is basically simplified explanation of various typical physical phenomena, which is very good because as a physicist, during your studies, you dig super deep in the detail of all these things, like from a math aspect and so on and so forth. But that book can reword that in very simple terms that are easy to understand to pretty much anyone. So this is pretty good in terms of figuring out how to better communicate complex things in a simple yet precise manner.
Right. That's interesting. Do you have a favorite fantasy novel or series?
The last one I read was the Night Angel trilogy, which was pretty good. There's the Salvatore books that was very popular when I was in high school. But I grew bored at like the 13th volume or something.
I stuck it out for a while.
Yeah, at some point I figured out that the plot was always the same, and I'm like, oh, here's what's happening, and then I lost interest in like these lighter type of novels. One of my childhood friend is an avid reader, so anytime I feel like reading some fantasy stuff, I go at his place and pick some book on his shelves, and hopefully I can go through it. I actually have two laying in my library right there that are half read, and don't think I'll ever finish them at this point.
Okay, fair enough. So last question here. If you had to give a smart, motivated person just finishing up college and about to enter the real world some advice, what would it be, or what advice should they ignore?
Okay. I think the most important one is to don't be afraid to try things you want to try. And you see that in many places, but it took me a while to kind of break my internal barrier of not trying things. And I think this is super important. Like, I've been through university thinking of I'm at this stage in my life where I have a house, I have a family, I have kids, and these are things I try not to lose, trying to move forward rather than have some setbacks. But at some point I figured out that like it could always be worse.
Right.
and like there are things that are more important than others, and like losing assets is not that dramatic. It sucks, but like there's worse thing to lose than stuff.
Right.
And once you accept that, I think it's much easier to navigate around building a business where you don't draw a big salary for a long time, and like the benefits are not super obvious for a very long time.
Right. Okay. That's awesome. Thanks very much. That was great. And we'll talk again soon.
Thanks to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at leansystems.co/podcast. And I would encourage you to sign up for our email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.